Hi, Sunita, and welcome to Be or Belong, the podcast where we talk to inspirational outsiders who go against the grain, and in my words, who choose to be rather than belong. And so you are one of them. So give us a brief introduction to you, what you do now, how you got there.
Well, first, let me say thank you so much for having me on your show, on your podcast this morning. I mean, it was a pleasure. When you reached out to me, I was just really happy and more intrigued by the name. So I think I wanted to ask you so many questions about that. And then in terms of me, well, I started off as a teacher and then I sort of drifted into the humanitarian world. Many years ago. I didn't actually choose teaching, but I think it chose me. I was a traveler and then I picked up languages. I used to travel to Venezuela often when I was a child. And from there, I started teaching some very short courses in Spanish, in English there, and then in Trinidad, when I came back, I could offer courses in Spanish. So it started off like that.
That's amazing. And would you mind just explaining briefly the situation with Venezuela and why there is a refugee crisis in the Caribbean?
Oh, well, in Venezuela, the economy went down. It basically crashed. If I'm not wrong, it's one of the countries that has the highest rate of inflation in the world. Now, you're talking about a country that was extremely advanced, extremely progressive some years ago, and then to reach to a stage very quickly, that situation would have deteriorated. And now it's so bad that children actually, some are dying. You would see children on the street going through the garbage just to see if they can get scraps of food. And if there is food, the costs are so extensive. It's so high that people can't buy. People are dying because they can't get medicine for, I would say, very common diseases. And it's a bit sad, not even drinking water, potable water. It's not available to them. I mean, nobody wants to leave their home, right? So if you find so many people leaving, and when you ask across the board, regardless to where in the world they settle down, it goes back to that. We had no food, we had no water, and most of them want to go back home.
So I know that you've had quite an involvement with Venezuela and activism regarding that. Was it because of something that you experienced when you went there, or how did you get involved in that kind of work?
I wouldn't consider myself like an activist in the truest sense of the word, but I was teaching at a university, and then I saw this. There was an ad. They were looking for people to design a curriculum and program for special needs. It was a different program, and I like challenges, so I applied for it. And it started off being about languages because they wanted someone that could actually transition persons that had come into the country to teach them the language. So it started off like that, and then it ended up in being something much bigger. But it wasn't that I chose or I was looking for, any involvement per se with the Venezuelan community. No, it was just a need that had to be filled. So I was there and trying to fill some gaps at that point. I worked with an NGO at that point for some years, and then, as I said, well, the program just expanded. It really went through the roof with all the needs, and with all the persons that were coming in. And it was not limited to Venezuelans. We have a lot of Cubans here, persons from Pakistan, Syria, even other islands. So I think it's more about helping those that are vulnerable, the displaced, people on the move generally.
Can you tell us a bit about what that involved, your work involved with those children?
It started off, I think it was around 2017, where there was no place for children that are displaced to attend schools. In our country, you need to have a student permit, of course, like most places, to attend school. And because when you are asylum seeking, when you are in that status, it's a bit difficult to be placed in schools. Nobody's fault. It's just, the reality of the situation. So this particular NGO, they were quite worried and they wanted to have an alternative program, somewhere that these children could go. So we opened what we call a temporary alternative learning space. The first day, 39 kids showed up, and we had children from all ages. And then within weeks, the program just expanded. And we started off in, I think it was September, October. By December, we had to move because we had like 3 rooms where we were, very humble beginnings. We actually had a really lovely person who had a business place. They realized what we were doing. They saw the kids. They saw how happy the children were to be there. We couldn't have all the children come out at the same time. So some would come 2 days, some would come 3 days, and then they offered one of their office spaces, but that couldn't, meet the demands. Imagine having nothing to do every day. Like, I mean, I guess it's kind of like what's happening with COVID now, where a lot of the children, they ended up having to stay home, but that was their reality every day. I mean, every day. So we wanted them to have something that could keep them going, could stimulate their minds, and then also maybe to transition them into the culture here in Trinidad, because a lot of them didn't know. And not having a school, how do you integrate them? How do you include them? So yeah, that's kind of where the project started.
Yeah, and so just for everyone listening who didn't read the description, you're in Trinidad and Tobago, and so what drove you to actually get involved in that project? Did someone approach you, or did you hear
No, well,
about
that was the NGO, and of course, as I said, I love challenges, and if you tell me that something has never been done before, I kind of like go head first into it. So I didn't think too much. I just went. I just started, and then every day it was like, okay, wow, this is going to be challenging, and what do we do?
you were heading it up? That was you were.
Yes, my job, and I call it a job, but I think it was really a calling. It was to basically lead the program, so I was in charge of everything. At some points, well, this was pretty early into the project. Some of the kids approached me and they were like, "Teacher, we didn't have breakfast," and I'm talking about babies, like 5 years old. So when they come to school like that, you realize, wow. So we needed to find a way to provide food. So that was another area that we had to work on. Then we ended up expanded into transportation. By the end of this project, I would have to say we had nearly 300 kids at the center. So yeah, it did involve a great deal of wonderful human beings that would give people with big hearts that would say, you know what, we will give food for a month, or we will commit to doing this. So as much as the NGO, yes, they funded most of it, we also had to look for other resources outside, and that took a bit of creativity. It took time, energy. We always knew it was going to be a temporary solution. That was the point. It was heartbreaking, but in 2019, it was around July, August, we ended up having to close off that program because there were like 1,000 kids in the country. And of course, all had to be provided for, and the program had to move to a different alternative. Child-friendly spaces were set up throughout the country to reach more children, and it was always supposed to go online to reach more students, but I think COVID sort of pushed that process a bit. But I also moved away from the NGO and I started doing other things, including my research. And yeah, it was time to move on. Sometimes you can do so much and you have to know when it's time to let something evolve on its own. So I think it was time.
What are the barriers to refugees entering normal schools? Why can't they enter normal schools? Is it because they're not deemed a citizen in Trinidad?
The thing is that, I mean, like anywhere else, you would have to get student permits, right? So, although Trinidad has signed the 1951 convention, we are a party to that. And I think that because it was also a very new phenomenon in this country and in the Caribbean, nobody knew what to do, nobody knew what was coming. It was hard to plan. Nobody had planned for this, right? So if you think about it, there was never any local legislation to deal with this. And because the situation just sort of cropped up, then you now find that people are asking the questions. But in the meantime, the kids are still out of school. So, it's sort of like the context. Something is happening, you really don't know, and it's not in any one person's hand to fix. So we just try to deal with it and to find a solution.
And so what did you learn from being with those children? Because obviously they must have experienced some intense trauma. And so have you learned any translatable skills for learning about other people in your life, or maybe that other people who are listening could apply to their lives? Because when we come out of COVID, a lot of people will have been dealing with big issues on their own, and then we'll finally be coming together. And is there anything you could say you learned from those children?
I think every day was honestly, every day was a learning experience for me on a personal level. I think my teachers also said the same to me every day. They felt that every day was new. Every day the kids would teach them something different. We learned to look at life differently and to appreciate life in a different way. We stopped taking things for granted. I had By the time I started this project, I had had like nearly 18 years of teaching experience at all levels. I had my master's, and I thought I knew about education, but meeting these kids, I really felt like I needed to start from ground zero. You meet children, some days they are emotional, and you're not prepared for that. I mean, as a teacher, you're prepared to go into a classroom and to deal with some level of trauma, but then you don't understand how much they depend on you until you're faced with it and you see them. And then all you can do is try to be as human as possible, try to deal with each situation as it comes, and try to, to make sure that that child is comfortable enough and feels safe enough. We always remember the do no harm principle. That's so important. So whatever we try to do, we make sure that it doesn't hurt anyone. And we had culture classes. That was something that came in after. We realized that we needed to have culture classes to teach these children about the locals. And when we had volunteers, we also had to do some sort of induction. So it's kind of about not being afraid, learning to accept things that might be new, might be different, and to see things, from different people's perspectives. I think that that was important, that I learned that. And I think it's important for us to sensitize and, make others aware that it's always important to sympathize and empathize with people, look at things from a different point of view. So.
And so how exactly did your world perspective change? Like, what kind of things did you stop taking for granted? Is there anything that you did before you worked there that you no longer do, or that you've started doing?
I wouldn't say things I no longer do. I would say maybe things I just think more carefully before I act, before I respond about things, because I never know how someone else might feel. So I try to be careful about that. I'm not always, but I try to be. Let me give you an example. Oh, okay. So some of the kids may have left their family members behind. So one might be a teenager and would have had to leave their little brother or sister behind. And, you don't know that going into the classroom. So one day you might be teaching a lesson and it might be family oriented. They might break down crying, and then you have to manage those sorts of situations. So I guess when I get up every day, I think, wow, I'm lucky that I can be in my country. I'm lucky that I don't have to fight for food, or I don't have to think about going through the garbage for food. I'm lucky. So I like to think of the positive things that I have instead of thinking about, okay, all the bad things in the world, because if we focus on the bad things, then we don't move forward. So I think positivity, maybe that's one of the biggest things that I came away with.
And so what about you made you want to, or fit for this job? What do you think within you drove you to want to do something like this? Because not everyone can do it. Not everyone is interested or prepared for that kind of challenge. So there must be something pretty special about you.
Well, I don't know if it's special. I just think that maybe it's my background. Maybe it's, where I came from. I had great parents, very good values, very good background. Um, and I think we were always like taught to share. We were always taught to be kind. We were always taught to help. I have never been able to just walk away if somebody's in need. If I walk down the street and somebody's hungry, I'm like, it bothers me. It's like, oh my gosh, no, nobody should be in that position. So I think it's just my personality. It's not that I purposefully was looking for a project, or it's just that every day something came up and we said, hey, let's see how we can resolve this. Let's see if we can resolve this, and not thinking too much, because if you think a lot, you might become overwhelmed. So you just take it in bits and pieces.
What's the situation with like access to therapy there? Because in England it's getting better, but I can imagine that those children, especially who didn't have money for food to eat in the morning, you must have sometimes taken on the role of a bit of a therapist in some instances.
Well, okay, so I know my limitations, and I know that I'm not I'm not a therapist. We did eventually get some help. We got some training from UNICEF, and it was a program called Return to Happiness. So we manage a program where we actually get the children to talk about the things that made them sad and maybe see some hope for the future, because that was something else that could be very depressing, where they would tell you, I'm never going to be able to do my exams. Why should I study? Things like that came up. So that was very helpful. We were also extremely lucky to have other, I would say, areas. It wasn't just purely academic. So we were able to inculcate things like yoga, dance, things where the children could, we had music, so they could actually have some outlet, physical education. So we had a holistic program, and then we also were lucky to get a psychosocial worker. So she was able to handle a lot of the guidance counseling and that sort of thing for us. We needed the help, and we were given that support. So again, I'm grateful for that.
Wow, that's amazing. And when you were saying about the children who feel like they have no hope because they feel like they're not going to pass their exams anyway, did you find a way in order to spark that curiosity among the next generation, or was there any ways that you found worked, or is it still a struggle?
I think it was helpful to actually let them just dream, just have like maybe 2 sessions and say, I want you to write down what you dream about, and I want us to think about how we could actually reach this dream, and so we could think realistically of how we could help the kids. Now, in fact, one or two of those kids went on to do some very, very wonderful things. One had a program on television where he was actually interviewing Trinidadians and Venezuelans. So he was bridging the gaps. And the thing is, those little things, it gave them encouragement, but it's not all the time. I mean, some kids would still be, very, I would say, sad. So, every day was kind of, hey, we encourage. But as I said, I think that's probably the main thing. You have to have patience, you have to work with them, and you have to do things just one step at a time and let them take everything one step at a time. Roll chunks, and it's manageable that way. You don't just try to like conquer the world in one day. It wouldn't work.
Did it have an emotional toll on you as well? Like each day when you went home, were there any days when you just felt, I can't do this anymore?
No, never I can't do this anymore, but days that I would just be tired. Days that, because I mean, the school hours were one thing, but then preparing for each day was another. Buying stuff for the school was another. Contacting people to make sure that everything was on time, making sure the food would be arriving on time, making sure transport, because you're responsible for these kids. You want to make sure they get home safely. You have to, the logistics was a lot. So physically, yes, it was taking a toll. Um, some days, yes, I would say, I would look at things and say, wow, what can I do differently? Because I'm one of those people, I like things to work. When you come across challenges, you might think, okay, what am I supposed to do? When you have a team of people looking up to you for the answers and you don't always have those answers, it's like, oh my gosh, I feel kind of overwhelmed here. What's the correct way to respond? When parents call you about something and you're not really, you just don't know what you're supposed to answer, because sometimes their child might be just extremely sad or depressed, and you are not the person to deal with that, or you don't know how to deal with that, and they want support as well. So in those things, yeah, I feel like maybe it was a little bit, it took a little toll. But what made it really nice was every day when I would get into the school, the kids would just line up, and before I reached to the office, each one would want a hug, or they would hug me, and that was like, wow, that was my reward every day.
That's
So
so beautiful.
it balanced off.
Wow. And so, but if you had situations like that where you weren't sure what the right decision was to do and people were looking to you for the answers, what did you end up doing? Were there any coping mechanisms that you developed, or did you find it was better to always have direction, or to simply say I don't know? Or
Well, sometimes, I mean, if I don't know, I don't know. So I would let them know, okay, I don't have the answer for you right now, but I can look for it. So I would, of course, I have supervisors, I would have to go to them. I always try to seek advice from people who might know, who would have the answers before I tell you, look, there is nothing that I can do to help. So I would always try to go to other people, see what they could advise, the best way forward. Of course, following protocols, because sometimes it's important to remember and know what protocols are in place, and to have somebody there to say, okay, well, look, this is what we should do. And yeah, sometimes I needed that.
And so what eventually caused the project to disband? Was it the lack of funding, or was that what happened? And then
Well, yes. I mean, to put it in simple terms, yes, it was not going to be sustainable because of funding. I mean, there's only so much you can do when the numbers just keep growing. So it had to, as I said, it had to end at some point. So yes, funding. I mean,
right. And so since then, what have you been doing? Because surely you had this huge purpose for that period of time where you were really driving for something really meaningful in your life, and then where did you even go from there after it was disbanded?
well, I do like some research in education, and I think I went back to that. I went back to the roots, and I started questioning, and I started thinking about, okay, this is what worked, this is what didn't work for children on the move, and I started writing about that. I did a presentation, and I published one paper. I did that presentation at Harvard in 2019, a little bit after. So I tried to keep busy, and I tried to see, okay, maybe I wasn't doing the face to face helping anymore, but maybe I could record information for other people to have some sort of guide if they had to take over and they had to do work. And then from there, well, in my PhD, I'm working on a sort of model that could be used for displaced persons that move into any country, but particularly for Trinidad and Tobago, so we could have a point of reference. So that has taken a lot of time from me. I started working as a consultant with IOM. The reporting is more like we do things like situational reports, again, for different displaced populations. It's for IOM is International Organization of Migration. So the project that I work on right now, it's in charge of 5 countries. So it's a lot of information to process, a lot of reading, and it's interesting to see the different contexts, things that are happening in other countries apart from Trinidad and Tobago, and to see the trends there. So it's a little bit broader than what I was doing before, but um, it's been interesting. It's been an interesting journey.
And was it a bit of a relief to step back from the front line as well? Because I remember you saying that in a way it was a conscious decision as well as the project disbanding. Was it also?
I wouldn't use the word relief because it was sad. It was just, it was something that it was hard to step back. It was really, really, really a sad day when we had our last day. I know it wasn't a relief. It was just, I knew it was time, and I said, okay, well, you do what you can with what you're given, but then at some point you also understand that, yeah, life takes you on different journeys. So you just make the best of it, and you make up your mind, you move forward. But no, I wouldn't say it was a relief. I never felt that it was a burden. That's the thing. So.
And so would you like to do something similar, more groundwork in the future?
I would, but I would do so maybe a little bit differently, maybe with more structure, you know, depending. it would be nice to get back into the field. Honestly, I've taken a particular liking to doing the research and the writing. I found that also a lot of persons they refer to it. Sometimes they have questions. Sometimes persons, because we still have people who are teaching online, so sometimes they would go to it. Sometimes they would call and say, "Hey, I saw that you wrote about this. Can you explain how we can do?" So I think that that is helping in a different way. And I discovered that I can write somewhat and I like the research. So I might also look for a fellowship when I'm finished with my PhD and maybe focus a little bit more on the research and then get back into the field when I feel a little bit more prepared.
Nice. And also, when you were younger, so when you were growing up with being in school in Trinidad and everything, were your classmates as interested in doing some humanitarian work? Like, is it accessible? And did you ever imagine that you would be doing what you are now when you were younger?
When we were going to school, it was very traditional. So children were in the classroom and everything was very teacher centered. It was not, we didn't have as much resources in the classroom. It was like you go to the book, you learn, you get your marks, and everything was very strict. A humanitarian, I honestly don't know that, in terms of like preparing for a profession, I would never say that it was a job. I would never say that there's something that prepares you. I would say it's a calling. So you in my case, I just sort of asked myself, okay, what can I do to help? And it was when the situation presented itself. It wasn't that I went looking for a project or no, something happens here and I'm going to try to help here. I've worked on other projects like with local children at different orphanages because we have a lot of children, even persons on the streets, children on the streets that would just approach you, they're hungry. So I've worked on different types of projects, and the thing is, I think it's about wanting to make the world a better place a little bit at a time.
What are those refugees that came to your school? What are they doing now? What's their situation now?
Well, I have to be honest. In some cases, I would have lost touch with some of them because it's so many. Some of them would have been placed because Trinidad is a transit country for a lot of persons. So it means that a lot of them, before COVID and border closures, some of them would have been placed in other countries where they are doing very well, going to school, where some of them started working. They have a lot of opportunities. There was another program that started off, they call it Equal Place, and that is run by several UN organizations, NGOs, CSOs on the ground, and they have some classes that are online where they can do exams. So I know that there are some solutions happening, but I'm not as involved as before. Now I'm just sort of like, at the background, just monitoring, learning. Sometimes the kids reach out if they need maybe food or whatever. They would still reach out to me and say, hey, teacher, I'm in this situation. So yeah, in terms of that, we still try to help. And I say we because the teachers and volunteers we still have a group. And when somebody needs something, we're always like, hey, remember this child? Where are you today? Do you think you could help? So if I can't help, we still have that going. So, but a lot of them are trying. They're trying to see a future. They're trying to have a future. Something really good that happened, and I must mention this, in 2019, the government opened some stay permits. So before they were in irregular status in the country, a lot of them, being refugees and migrants, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have regular status. So the government opened up a registration process, and that was like a really, really excellent move in terms of, something very positive. So that helped, at least parents were able to freely go to work and that sort of thing. Of course, it was for Venezuelans. We still have Cubans, that didn't have the option. But I think that it was a really great and generous move, and we're seeing that sort of trend happening across the Caribbean. So I'm very hopeful about that as well. We just need to be hopeful, and we need to sort of prepare ourselves for what is here and what we're confronted with at this point. I think that that's as much as we can do. Maybe not think too far ahead.
True. And do you have any life sayings or quotes that you live by, just to finish off our conversation with?
Well, I think I keep saying this. It's sort of just be positive, be that positive change, and try to help the world a little bit at a time. I think for me, that is it, and that's what I live by. So,
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for being a guest on the To Be or Belong podcast, Sunita. It's been an absolute joy talking to you, and I'll see you all next time.